"Oh, Russell Simmons, I loved his show," and I was like, "Of course, mom. Like that's how people perceive him. You know, is that reality show, like mainstream. That's where they think of him, Family Man."
Yeah, and it
Yeah, I
speaks
was
to
going to say, I feel like the media is protecting Russell Simmons, and that's why we're not seeing it.
And it speaks to kind of a larger issue too of do we discount the stories of Black women in this realm when we talk about sexual assault? If it wasn't for Lifetime airing R. Kelly's story, that wouldn't have reached a large audience. I mean, we knew back in the 90s, Dave Chappelle made a whole skit about R. Kelly peeing on folks. We made a joke out of it. It wasn't until a white network highlighted the tragedy of it all that we took it seriously. And even with the population we work with, you know, a number of our young girls between 18 and 25, they kind of just take sexual assault as the norm. It's just kind of a normal part of life. It's just what can be expected. And when those types of attitudes kind of trickle and follow you into adulthood, we start to see men like Russell Simmons and some of the others really kind of just not even get away with it, but almost share tactics, almost even unintentionally coach other young boys that this is just how you handle women or this is just your experience with women. And it's kind of a sad vehicle that we keep driving in our community. And I don't know. I've been brainstorming for years, Winter, and I know you do too, especially in the position. What do we do about it? How do we influence an entire culture? I mean, Drew's experience was back in the 90s.
Right.
We're 30 years out now, and we're still dealing with it.
Yeah. And we've made progress, but there's so much
Have we?
more.
Have
In,
we?
in,
I
in
mean, we've made progress, I think, in other ways,
Mhm.
but they made a huge point on like where would music be around Black women if a lot of Black women didn't leave because of the sexual objectification assaults that they experienced in that industry.
Mhm.
So I feel like the industry and the music that comes out is transformative towards the culture in the industry. So that's why I say halfway, not necessarily around the advancements that women have made, but just specifically in that industry for Black women.
Mhm.
Now, wouldn't you love to hear one of these big female hip hop rap stars do a song ripping men for this? Like, wouldn't you like men just can rip women in their music, but wouldn't you love to just hear a woman like really have a great song that just kind of gets into this sexual assault and like,
You know who would do it? Lizzo. I feel like Lizzo would do it. She would just
yeah,
But I feel like they try, but their voices don't get far because who is putting out the music? I mean, once again, only 7% of hip hop producers are women. And they actually started a movement that nobody knows about. And it's called 7% Are Us. And it's talking about paying them their fair share when it comes to music production and working in that industry because they get paid less, they get promoted less, and if they don't kind of take on this like sexy persona, they don't even get, I mean, they don't get any business.
Yep.
and
So
Drew was on her way there.
People tried.
12 o'clock on the dot. So I'm gonna go ahead and hit the start streaming button and get us going. Prayers that everything goes smooth. Okay. So we are just going to give it like 5, 10 seconds. People to join in and we will begin. Hi, I'm Winter, and I am the program coordinator for Green Dot of Palm Beach County, an evidence based violence reduction program that promotes bystander awareness and intervention. Thank you for joining us today for our virtual discussion of the documentary film On the Record, which chronicles the story of Drew Dixon, the first woman of color in the wake of the Me Too movement to come forward and publicly accuse a well-known hip-hop mogul of sexual assault. Sexual violence is the act of forced sexual interaction. It impacts millions of people worldwide, but unequivocally affects women at a higher rate, and particularly women of color. While more than 4 out of 10 Black women experience physical intimate partner violence, only 1 out of every 15 Black women who are raped reports her assault. Faced with a multidimensional burden about the choice of speaking up, the experiences of Black women are often disregarded. Today, I'm joined by a panel of professional women from the community to discuss the intersection of sexual assault with race, culture, and privilege, as well as influence. I'd like to welcome our audience and each panel member who can go ahead and introduce themselves. And I'll start with Holly Caratanudo.
Thanks, Winter. I'm Holly Caratanudo. I'm the Sexual Assault Outreach Coordinator for Palm Beach County Victim Services, which is the Certified Rape Crisis Center for Palm Beach County.
You guys can just go on. Clarice.
All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Clarice Redding Lewis, Director of Community Services at Vita Nova, Inc.
Thank you, Clarice. Rodina.
Hello, my name is Verdina Mezidou. I'm a licensed clinical therapist in private practice, and I specialize in working with women and girls in sexual trauma.
Thank you, Rodina. Darlene.
Hi, my name is Darlene Blanc. I am a human resources professional. I do work as an EAP advocate within my industry, and I also am a life coach working with women who have experienced trauma in their life and helping them to navigate through just the various degrees of issues that they'd like to overcome and achieve. And yeah.
All right. Thank you, Darlene. Thank you, ladies, so much for being here today. I am excited to get into this conversation and to definitely get your perspective and your input on this topic. So let's go right in. Early on, and I'm not going to direct the questions at anyone in particular. I'm just going to, state the questions, and whoever wants to answer, you're welcome to jump in and answer a question. Early on, before going into her story of the assault, Drew begins to talk about the disconnect she felt from the Me Too movement. She said that she remembers feeling like it's not for us, referring to women of color. Drew said that when the Weinstein accusations surfaced, she didn't know if speaking out applied to her. The film also starts out with a young lady answering the question, what is missing from Me Too? She expressed that it was hard to say exactly, but that she doesn't think that it's a coincidence that most of the women who have come forward in Hollywood have been white women who are generally quite successful. She went on to point out the earning power of people in America, and at the very top are white men. At the bottom are women of color, which she says is something she believes is necessary to look at when we talk about who gets to come forward and give their stories about surviving sexual abuse or sexual assault. Now, ironically, the Me Too movement was started by a Black woman. So I have two questions. What do you think might contribute to Drew or other women of color feeling like speaking up didn't apply to them? And how do you think that this earning power or financial dynamic ties into speaking up about sexual assault? That's a loaded question.
It is a loaded question. I'd like to, just start off by saying once again, thank you, Winter, for hosting and coordinating this discussion, because it's extremely important. The first question I had to ask myself as I was watching the documentary is like, first, I wanted to really understand what is the Me Too movement and why it was created. And so now we know that a Black woman, Tarana Burke, she's the founder of the movement. Its inception was in 2006. And so she explained during a TED Talk about the purpose of the movement, and it's built on empathy for survivors and not attacks on men. So it's really for anyone, mostly in marginalized groups of people who have limited access to power and social privileges. What was interesting about Drew is that she shared her rising career ladder to being an A&R executive at Def Jam. And so one would think her success and the respect people had for her in the music industry would give her like the confidence to speak up sooner. However, there was something that she said that was so familiar to me, like the harassment she was subjected to was tolerated in the workplace culture prior to her even working there. And so her power was established, right? Her talent, everyone knew she was good at what she did, identifying good artists and music, unlike her direct report, who had not only power, earning power in his respective industry and social privileges. And so when I consider like race and like multiple systemic issues for women of color, like I can't help but notice or ask, does Me Too apply to me? Like the Black, Latino, Indigenous woman, they've been dealing with this for years, this issue for years. So while I empathize with anyone, regardless of race, who's been a victim of sexual assault, like it can come across as a slap in the face, almost like when a white woman with a celebrity status or financial and social privilege has a platform and a voice to get the necessary coverage and support while silencing those who have been suffering this particular issue for years and centuries. And so, yeah, it's really a complex issue, but really that was my overall thought as you asked that question.
Mm-hmm. Great point, Darlene, on what you shared. And I think part of this too is that the Me Too movement really took on when a white woman tweeted about it, Alyssa Milano. And so when Alyssa Milano tweeted about it, it then became part of her voice and part of power being taken around that, and a lot of white women coming forward for white men. And this whole movement was brought to the public eye through a white voice. And so I could understand how for Drew, for her to feel like, does this include me? Because oftentimes, and we know this is systematic, this is historical as well. You know, we talked about the slavery aspect of Black women being sexually objectified and no one being able to defend, no one being able to say anything. And so we normalize and we silence ourselves and we make it this thing that, you know, even if I do speak, nothing's going to happen. So is there even a reason where this movement would include me to where it would push something forward?
No, I think that's the reality. And even when we take it back, you know, centuries, and we think about just in our nation, our relation with race and being a woman, so being a Black woman, we traditionally kind of hold to this belief that white womanhood is protected, you know, and where Black women, because for so long we were viewed as property, it was a matter of being objectified. So I think that kind of translates into the psyche of America. So we may even begin to feel, you know, am I worth it? Is it worth it? Am I going to be jeopardizing my family, my career? I already had to work 10 times harder to get to this place. Am I willing to really watch all of that come toppling down? Mm-hmm. And I think that's just kind of a sad reality that we kind of have to deal with, and we live with that. Mm-hmm. And even thinking about the Me Too movement in and of itself, you're right. Not only was it Alyssa Milano that sort of brought fame to this movement, but then all of the women who sort of carried it forward. Right. You know, I didn't see, and even working in the field, I didn't see many Black voices contributing to that. And even today, I still don't know if we see many Black voices contributing to that. Mm-hmm. It's just sort of, I don't know, it really gets me thinking, would having money be enough? You know, even if we had the same earning potential, even if we had the same access to power, so to speak, because there have been some Black women in power who have shared their stories of sexual assault, but there's still this backlash from the community. So I don't know if money and power are enough to sort of gain that empathy from the community at large. And that's really what's lacking, is the empathy. It's almost a slap in the face to say, well, maybe you deserved it. Whereas I don't hear that same verbiage when it's a woman outside of a community of color stepping forward with her claims or accusations. It's almost a different attitude.
When the intersectionality of this are our Black idols that are coming up and being the only one, right? And so even in this particular scenario where Def Jam was like a Black label, and so the people, the artists who may not be able to go to a major label are being signed on Def Jam, right? And so Russell is being held to be like this king of hip hop and really this one way. And so I think we also have to talk about how racial institution in this country really contributes to the silencing of Black women's voices. I think that's a huge part in this power notion, because if this power is taken down, what else are we taking down from our culture? What else are we taking down from our people? What else are we taking down from our opportunities? And so, Drew talks about taking it for the team in a sense.
So we're going to go in that direction. We're going to go in that direction. And I'm glad that you are bringing that up. I want to backtrack a little bit to say I'm glad that you brought up the point of Alyssa Milano being the person who retweeted this and then kind of brought fame to the movement. And the reason I say that is because we did host a screening yesterday of the film, very diverse audience. And one of the things that was brought up was, hey, I thought that a Black woman created the Me Too movement, so why would Black women feel like they aren't a part of it? And that was part of the discussion that went from there. So a lot of people don't even realize, one, that a Black woman did create the movement, but also why it didn't it wasn't propelled from her doing it. It really stemmed from Alyssa Milano tweeting it, and then it took off from there.
And then it was overshadowed by Time's Up. So instead of supporting and uplifting a Black woman who's already having a movement with similar messaging, these prominent people came and made a whole movement separately, Time's Up, that completely overshadowed the Me Too movement.
And I'm not going to get on my soapbox, but this is not the only industry or area where we see this happening, where women of color may be a catalyst for something, but never receiving the credit. There's no notice, no mention, no footnote. It takes, a white woman or a white man to propel something forward. And that's an issue with American culture. It goes beyond, sexual assault awareness, but I'm going to save that for the next discussion.
Yeah. And just to say, for everyone who's watching, this is a conversation we're having the hard conversations right here. And it's not just about race, but it is about that as well. The documentary touched on that, and it intersected with so many different elements. And so right now, today, we're going to talk about as much as we can. And I know some people may be thinking like, well, wait, is this what this whole thing was about? It is part of it. It's a big part of it. So I just want to, preface this entire conversation by saying we're going to talk about it. We're going to, bring these things up and discuss it because it's important. And then we're going to also, bring it around. We're going to bring it all the way around. So for anybody who's watching who is wondering, I just wanted to say that we're going to have
a point. And just one last thing about that too is just like race is a huge part of it too, because we have Sojourner Truth. One of her biggest pieces is called "Ain't I a Woman," and that is all about like I should be respected and honored, and I should be having doors open for me and umbrellas open for me and treated with this delicacy that white women get. But ain't I a woman too, just because I'm Black? And I think if we don't talk about how race makes an impact into how women is treated, then we're missing a huge part of how sexual assault on Black women gets scooped under the rug, and how it's the intersectionality with also workplace sexual assault, or just in our community. It's just this regard that we desire to be treated as delicate and respected as our counterparts.
Absolutely.
As she said.
Professionals in the field do, we often say, well, why don't Black women come forward? Why don't they report? And I think it's important to look at the structures that are in place for them to report. And traditional rape crisis centers were created in the 1970s. And when they were created for white privileged women. So the reason, we're saying, putting the blame on the women, saying, why don't they report? Well, let's take a look internally and say, like, what structures do we have in place that aren't for them, that they don't feel like they can access. And I think it's a conversation we need to have, not just as a rape crisis center, but again, all of our services, our mental health services. You know, we say, why doesn't the Black community seek mental health services? Are they created for them? Are they the ones that they need? Are they the ones that they desire? It's not even just in the rape crisis field, it's in all of the social services fields, ensuring that our services, we need to start doing a census of our services. Are they what the community needs, instead of blaming people for not coming forward and accessing services?
Absolutely. I think the same way that we put a focus on making things gender responsive, it should also be culturally responsive as well. You know, there's reasons for why people are who they are and how we've experienced the world differently, you know. So I agree. Thank you guys so much for that, for your input. Great points. Great points. So question number 2. Drew Dixon held a high-level position at Def Jam Records during the Pulse, the very coming up of hip-hop and R&B. She worked with some of the biggest name artists of that time who are still relevant and even considered legends today. Russell Simmons himself going on to become known as the king of hip-hop and a very successful worldwide mogul. Drew spoke about being proud of what Russell was achieving and not wanting to let the culture down. She said that one of the reasons she stayed quiet for 22 years was because she felt like the Black community would hate her. She mentioned the need and the duty to protect Black men, justifiably, and feeling like the Black community would look at her like, so are you going to put this before the race? Let's talk about this. All the things Drew felt she had to consider about speaking out. Race loyalty. What are your thoughts on this? Is it fair? Even today, do women of color who are survivors of sexual assault have the weight of the entire race on their shoulders?
Absolutely. And that's disgusting. I really don't have any, highfalutin professional way to put that. I think that's a disgusting reality. And it's not even just in terms of sexual assault, but I think every day, especially in light of what's happening now in our communities, we wake up and we are faced with the challenge. What comes first?
Mm.
Is it that I'm Black? Is it that I'm a woman? Is it my faith? Is it my position? Is it family? We have to kind of decide, what are we going to put at the forefront? If I make a decision that I know is going to impact a system, and it could possibly be a detriment to my race or a detriment to the representation in our culture, those are things that we do have to consider. We have to think about that. And I know so many Black women, so many professional women who are never going to come forward because they're worried about whose life they will destroy, whose career, whose reputation. We look at all of the great things that this man has done, and the question is, do I want to dismantle that? But at what cost are you staying silent? And we have a community that definitely perpetuates that notion. We have other women in the community who are saying, I'm sorry that happened to you, but think about all of the wonderful things that he's done. Think about the type of father he is. Think about the man he is. You got to understand, we don't have many role models in the race. And I'm thinking, well, if that man is a rapist, is he really a role model?
Mm.
Those are the questions that we have to ask. And it's hard. I think it's really hard.
It is. I love the point you brought up about waking up in the morning and deciding which is more important here today that who am I going to show up as today? And it's really so true. And we could go hard left into that conversation, but it's very true.
And this is a complex question, I think, not just for workplace sexual assault or even in the context of the music culture that we're talking about, but just in sexual assault in general, right? One of the things here we talked about, the protection of Black men or race loyalty, but that is also done. 90% of sexual assault is by someone that you know, which means that you have a feeling of connection to this person. One of the things that Drew even mentioned is, I love Russell. And a lot of us probably loved something about Russell or love something about someone who has done the sexual assault. And I think we have to talk about the ambivalence that comes up as a sexual trauma survivor. We have to talk about it because we feel it. We feel the ambivalence because it's on one hand, I really had a relationship with this person. I had a relationship with this person. This person demonstrates certain significance. And that could be, for Russell, that could be a family member, that could be a friend, that could be a partner. You know, as sexual trauma survivors, we have relations. And so the protection is not just for the person, but I think it's for the connection. It's for the lack of, it's for the scarcity that happens in our culture as well. With like Clarice mentioned around if we put this person down, then who else is it going to be? And I think there's a lot of lack of scarcity and broken relationships in the Black community as a whole. And so I just don't think it could be just as easy as we just need to, not protect, right? There's a lot of things that comes into it that I think makes this decision even harder in the aspect of stepping up.
And we put such responsibility on women to have to do this
Mhm.
work, right?
Right.
I think Drew said at one point she didn't want to leave Jenny swaying in the wind, and she
Right.
knew she had to step up. And as women, we feel like we constantly have to protect one another and step up. And one of my favorite moments in the documentary was when the two radio hosts were having that discussion. And the one
Yes.
radio host was like sending his prayers to Russell's family or something, and the other guy's like, what? Like, who are you sending your prayers to? And they had this like real conversation. And the guy's like, we all knew. Like, we knew. Like, this isn't surprising. We're not surprised to be hearing this. And we
No.
need to send our prayers to any woman who's ever worked in this industry for the past 30 years. And I feel like hearing men protect, you all had spoken about as Black women having to protect Black men. Well, where are the men who are going to stand up and protect women and say that this behavior in the workplace, in the community, wherever, is just not acceptable? Because really that's where the change comes in, when the society and the culture decides this isn't acceptable anymore, and they start to step up, and it becomes more of an influence throughout the entire culture and workplaces.
Absolutely. It has to be a restoration circle,
Mhm.
right? Just put the focus and all the services on Black women. We need it, but we also need to put a focus on the Black men. Like the teen pregnancy is more likely to be linked to the male than it is to the female. You're more likely to have a male impregnate women for teen pregnancy. So that means we're only focusing, and Drew mentioned this, like, you're the crime scene. You're looked at the crime scene and everything is focused on you. And aside, of course, the person, what they did was wrong and they're the perpetrator, but where is the restoration and the rehabilitation and all the things that this person needs so that it doesn't repeat as a pattern in our community? I think those are, and we talk about that in domestic violence as well, in aspects of bringing in the male as needing services as well, as being part of this picture.
And she talked about how before she even decided to go public, the New York Times was doing a full background investigation of her. And it's like, what does she need a background investigation for? Like, she's the victim, but too
Right.
often there's like this onus on the victim to be a good person and to be believed, when we don't do that with perpetrators.
It's the accountability piece, and we see that a lot in family structures in the Black community. We coddle our Black sons, we hold them close to us, yet we put our Black girls out there and say, all right, you're of age now, time to start living your life, go make money, go do whatever. We don't even keep a close eye on them half the time. But when it comes to our young Black boys, because there may not be another male presence in the home, we sort of lift them up on this pedestal as if they can do no wrong. But then where is the male leadership and the male guidance? Who is shaping them? Who is shaping their view of women, their view of the world, their view of sexuality? And we start to see this brokenness sort of infiltrate our communities. And even going back to other instances of women of color with sexual assault, almost normalizing it, almost taking it as, okay, this is just part of my experience as a woman, and not holding men in our community accountable at all. And that starts from a very young age of not having an accountability or any accountability system for that boy. And they grow up to be these broken men who don't even realize that what they're doing is, not to make excuses, but I've met with many men who are perpetrators who have maybe verbally even recounted a story to me. And I'm thinking, do you hear yourself? Do you realize that what you're saying, that this is a crime? This makes you a rapist. And when you put it in those plain terms, they really have to go back and think and analyze all of their past sexual encounters. And I'm like, who is guiding you? Who is steering you? And then when you really get down to the root of it, the answer is no one. It's media.
Yeah. Russell kept saying, I'm not a violent person. That was like his go-to I'm not a violent person. And I thought, he doesn't get it. He doesn't even know what violence is. He thinks violence is bleeding and bruising. And I think he really disconnected. I think he knows, but there's like a mental disconnection between understanding what he did was sexual violence. You know, we say rape sometimes and we forget that it's sexual violence and that it is violent behavior.
I'd say not really wanting to acknowledge that it is sexual violence. He knows.
Absolutely. And there were so many of them who shared in their story how they were fighting and screaming, no, no, no. A lot of them recounted that. How could you not associate that as being violent or forceful or aggressive in some nature? So I think he's just completely denying.
Yeah. And one of the things I did want to point out, because so many valid points are brought to the table, I think that the personal accountability is the one thing that oftentimes get overshadowed by also the over policing of or within the Black community as well, Black people of color. And I think that, when you think of that as well, you try to protect. I'm not sure if it's more of a race loyalty as opposed to a gender loyalty, because you're trying to protect the Black men because of just the systemic and the historical nature of how they have been abused and how they have been treated. And so it's not to negate their actions at all, because I think personal accountability is important. But I think one aspect that is such a burden to bear also is just thinking about how are we being treated as a race in general. So it really is a lot. It's complex.
That's true. We're afraid he'll be taken. Like if I tell on him, if I tattle on him, he'll be taken from the community, taken from the home, and we'll have still this void of Black men. I think that's real.
Yeah, I think that's interesting that you bring that up, because before we officially got on, Clarice was mentioning, we were talking about how Oprah initially was a part of this film, and then she backed out for, reasons that we really don't know. And one of the things Clarice said is, what about, Black women supporting other Black women? So I think it does also make sense for what you're saying, Darlene, that maybe it has to do with the gender and maybe not specifically so much race loyalty, but like the Black man's role. Because if it were a woman, would it be the same thing? Like Oprah had the opportunity to back this, to support it, and for, to make it probably even bigger than what this film ended up being, but she backed down from it. So interesting, the connection that's there. Okay. Everybody take a deep breath. So getting into Drew's story, she talks about when she discovered that there was no CD in the disc player, something that we find out was an intentional trap that was set. She talks about how after he began exposing himself, she felt like he was this puppy dog who she had to keep retraining. She said he wasn't violent and he always sheepishly apologized. And I want to say, when she said he wasn't violent, I think she was referring to at that point in the office, because he had started exposing himself in the office to her. So he would do this, then he would always sheepishly apologize. And so she thought that he felt bad. So does her gently steering him back on track each time and rationalizing that he wasn't violent in those instances speak to the nature of women at all? Do women often excuse sexual abuse and misbehavior this way?
Ooh, take a sip of water while y'all get your thoughts together.
I think that may be specific to the role that she was in her experience, being that she was in an executive role and the culture that they had in the workplace. And so someone else had talked about, I can't remember, the lady with the short hair had talked about the environment of the industry, right? And so this aspect of, well, if you're going to stay there, you have to figure out how you maneuver it in a way that even has some type of manipulation of self-protection for women, keeping it at bay, of keeping this sexuality in place to keep your job, but knowing that you really don't want any of these advances, but you're trying to protect yourself so that you can continue being in this particular place. And so I can't say that I would make a generalization that is women's nature. I do think that there could be some patterns of caretaking that happens with women. There could be patterns, and not just women, men as well. Obviously, there's aspects of him that comes into this, but some codependency that really comes up around, okay, when I see a violation, how am I setting this boundary with this person, or even if this person is respecting the boundary? So I think what she was expressing was more in the nature of their relationship. And that's part of the ambivalence that comes when you have such a close connection to someone who's betraying you.
Mm-hmm. Very good point. Good point.
Yeah, I really related when she talked about having two options. When someone's like kind of approaching you in this way of either complying or letting them think that there's a little chance, because the alternative is they're going to take what they want, or she said she'd be unemployed. And I felt like as a woman, and especially as a young woman, when you don't necessarily have that backbone yet to put those boundaries in place, you do kind of resort to that. I don't want to offend anyone, or I don't want to, I was taught to be polite, or I was taught to, listen to authorities. So we don't teach young women when they go into the workplace that listening to authorities doesn't mean that your boss can touch you inappropriately or come on to you. I think we could do a better job of talking to young people about sexual harassment in the workplace, because too often we hear those stories of their first job and their boss came on to them and they complied because they thought they didn't have another option. Like, I'm going to have to comply or I'm going to lose my job. And I, when she talked about that, I was like, that's real. Like, that's what happens when you're, she still was young. She was fresh out of college working in this field and not necessarily understanding that dynamic of, this is my boss and I want this person to respect me. But then, so you can't be like, okay, you can't come in here and pull your pants down. Like, that's inappropriate because I could get fired for saying that.
24, she said. She was 24 years old.
Yeah.
So young.
So young.
It's so difficult too, because I think about patterns of sexual assault. We think about the grooming process, right? Or how they identify their victim. So thinking about the mind of a perpetrator, it always starts, well, typically it starts out as, maybe making these small little gestures and advances, and it may grow into something bigger, especially when we see sexual assault in the workplace. And it's that thought of, okay, how far can I go? Is she going to let me get away with this time? And it just builds and builds and builds. And even thinking about how perpetrators try to rationalize, we hear these stories and you hear in the courtroom, well, I exposed myself and she didn't say anything that time, or I did this and she didn't say anything, I invited her back to my apartment and she didn't object to it. And they try to build, I think in their mind, they're actually maybe believing that this is okay because nothing may have been said in those prior interactions. And then oftentimes they may not come off as being violent. I think when we think about sexual assault, people automatically assume it's got to be like a scene out of a Lifetime movie where they're chasing you down the street. And those things do happen, don't get me wrong. But that's not oftentimes, and I know Winter and Holly can probably speak to this, that's not always the nature of the story that we hear. Rodina said it earlier. 90%, somewhere in that range, it's a person that you have some form of relationship with. And sometimes when you sit with victims and you ask them to recount their history with that person, there may have been these small, tiny moments where there was inappropriate activity, inappropriate wording. And we also live in a culture where when a man makes an advance on a woman, we're supposed to believe that, oh, that means he thinks you're attractive. That's a good thing. We take that as a positive, even if we're uncomfortable with it. So recounting those small moments in time that may have led up to the attack, I don't know if it's necessarily the nature of women and us excusing the misbehavior and the abuse so much as just how we're socialized to react to men.
Yeah, so true. I agree with that so much. And how many of us in our everyday lives experience some form of sexual harassment, even though we may not acknowledge it? We may come into work going through security and having to hear catcalls or, the little slick things that the security guard is saying, and we just go on about our day, and may not really address it, but it happened and we may have felt uncomfortable about it. And then there's so many dynamics as to why we may say something or not say something. How are we going to be looked at? I mean, for so many different reasons as well. And someone in the comments was saying that people may also honor their friendships over holding someone accountable. And so, that could be what was going on with Drew as well. Like she said, she loved Russell, and
She wanted him to stop. Like, it wasn't that she wanted him fired before the assault, right? When he was doing this inappropriate behavior on the sexual harassment, she just wanted him to stop. And she thought, eventually, I'm going to be valuable enough. I've done all this great work. He'll knock it off, and I don't want to burn that bridge. And when you talk to victims of sexual assault, and Darlene was talking about how we often, don't want someone criminalized or punished in that way. And that's so true. When you talk to victims, sometimes they do have that feeling of, I want them just to go to jail and be away. A lot of times they're like, I don't want them to ever do this again. Like, I want this behavior to stop. I want them to get help. And, we have restorative justice tactics out there now that allow for the victim to have that voice and say, I don't want this person's life to be in jail and that's the end of it. I want them to know that they did something wrong, take accountability for what they did and not do it again and be restored in some way. And that's not easy with a predator. Like, you think of Russell Simmons and Harvey Weinstein, these people with like years of sexual assaults and years of predatory behavior. But that first instant when someone acts on that behavior, if you're able to intervene then on a young boy who maybe, doesn't understand power and control, doesn't understand, consent, if you're able to intervene then and stop them from doing that behavior later in life and doing it again, that's what we're all wanting to happen. And I think the media sometimes and mainstream media thinks that we just want to put everybody in jail and lock them away and get rid of them. But that's not what we're asking for. We don't want this behavior to exist anymore.
Right. And they say the best apology that you can ever give to someone is change behavior. And I see it time and time again where, I mentioned earlier that I'm a human resources professional, and I see and I hear the stories about women coming forward, and also men as well, but majority of the cases are women, where they really just want the man to acknowledge what he did and to stop. Like, that's really what it boils down to, is acknowledge and take accountability for your actions. Stop harassing me and every single person who's brought your misbehavior to your attention. Once you acknowledge and take personal accountability, then I think that we can move on and we continue to have fruitful relationships and fruitful discussions and really begin healing, that healing process. So you hit the nail on the head on that one. Change behavior, really, it can move mountains.
Speaking of people bringing it to that person's attention, that brings me to my next question. This documentary also includes, this documentary also includes accounts of other women who accused Russell Simmons of sexual assault. Do you think that no one at Def Jam knew about his behavior? What are the barriers to men and women intervening in situations of sexual assault or harassment? And how can one successfully navigate or overcome those barriers? And what messages does it send to others when people don't intervene?
I mean, this is Russell Simmons, a household name. I think when I was in college, everybody had a little rush card, put a little refund checks on. So it's not like this is someone who is lacking in power, lacking in resources, and for lack of better terms, probably has a lot of the media industry in his pocket.
And
Let me go back to the Oprah thing. I truly believe that they might have had some phone calls. Hope he ain't watching. Don't come get me, Russell. But they might have even had some phone calls where he's like, "Listen, friend, I don't want you to air this." And so I think that everybody at Def Jam probably knew. And this was probably just, once again, normalized behavior. We already know that in the music or entertainment industry, sexual assault is normalized. The casting couch, that's a very real thing.
so
And
what do you think the barriers are to men and women intervening in these situations of harassment and sexual assault? Why don't people speak up? All right, we know this is Russell Simmons, right? But this happens on a lower level every day, So why don't people speak up? It's happening in the office across the street.
A culture starts from the top down, right? And so, if the people at the top are setting a tone that you can't come against me, you can't say anything against me, and I have people in place that will silence you, that will shut you out, that will minimize, that will degrade you in front of this person, then it doesn't create an environment to speak. I think in environments where you have a leader who shares, it could be a man leader or a woman leader who shares the importance of creating a safe environment for everyone. You have more of a culture where people feel that they can have a voice and speak to HR, or that they can have a voice and speak to their supervisor. It also depends on the person who are in power on how they respond. I've heard sexual trauma victims, even in their workplace, have comments that are done to them inappropriately. They bring it to their supervisor, and their supervisor has a minimal response.
Mhm.
And so, what that tells them, am I viewing this the wrong way? Am I too sensitive? Because I already have my own history of sexual trauma that might come in the way of how I'm viewing this. And so she goes and she shares it to another person, and that person's reaction was completely different. And this person was in a higher position, and she said that should have never happened. That supervisor should have never responded in that way. And so I think it starts from what are the people in executive and leadership positions saying about how we address this in the workplace? What are structures that are in place? What are safety measures that are in place that promotes this aspect of everyone should feel safe and secure and should have a voice no matter who this is in regards to? And so if you're not creating that environment, whether that's in a family, whether that's in a workplace, whether that's in a church, whether that's in a community, we know that happens in the military because the people in power are not creating places for you to speak. And so I think it really depends on that, creating a culture where everyone can have a voice and their voice can be heard and validated.
Absolutely. That was an amazing response. It starts at the top. It starts at the top. And that's the very essence of prevention, is speaking up, being proactive, and saying, we don't stand for this. I don't stand for this. And here's how we're going to do things here in this organization on this level. And you are either going to fall in line with that culture or you're not. A culture of safety, and feeling like it's okay to come forward and speak up and say that this has happened without worrying about repercussions or, so many of the things that we have to think about. So,
And they can't let things
And
slide by. They have to, like, what's good for one person is good for everyone, because too often, things are minimized. Oh, that's their personality. That's inappropriate. There shouldn't be those blurred lines in a workplace. When relationships start to form in a workplace, it's inappropriate. We have to remain that professional. People don't want to hear it, but that's, you're in a professional workplace. That's how it has to be. And, if you've ever worked in an environment where that type of culture existed, where everyone was appropriate and respectful, male, female, you see the productivity, you see the environment and the enjoyment you have in coming to work when that culture exists, that things are not tolerated, and you can have, great relationships with your male or female coworkers, and there's no feeling of inappropriateness there, and you become like great friends with these people, and it's just a completely different vibe than in an environment where that's not happening and where things are sliding by and things inappropriate behaviors happening.
And
Yeah,
we
you're
have
definitely
to
right on
know,
that. Oh, go ahead.
yeah, sorry. I was just gonna say we have to also know that even in the workplace, we can work towards restoration and rehabilitation, right? Up to a certain point, up to a certain extent. But at a certain point, I have to know that if I do something wrong, I can engage in a process, maybe with a person or without, where because part of this is coming up is a fear of retaliation as well. And so, if I come up as a leader and I'm the one who made the mistake, what is going to be the support that I receive if I do take accountability in regards to restoring and rehabilitation? So I think that has to also be part of the discussion, not just, okay, come and bring when you're feeling unsafe, but how do we provide an environment of support and rehabilitation for people involved?
Absolutely. And Holly, I think you really touched on something when you said people don't want to talk about it. People don't want to hear it. And that is key with so many different issues, not just this. When you come into the workplace, it's like, okay, we're here in this space and we're not going to talk about that. So, not wanting.
Someone in the chat box asked about the difference between the allegations against Russell and L.A. Reid, and it kind of touches on that. And someone had mentioned, like, when you're a sexual trauma survivor and you go into a workplace, I don't know what it is about predators, but they almost can sniff it out, and they know, and they take advantage of that vulnerability. And I think that's exactly what L.A. Reid did. He knew that she had been put in this position before, and he could control her through it. And when she didn't comply, he punished her in terms of her work productivity and took away all of her great contracts. And it's just as bad. It's sexual harassment. No matter, even if he didn't lay his hands on you, it's still sexual harassment. He tried, and she denied him, and he, quid pro quo, took it away from her, took away all her good contacts and all of her ability to sign new artists.
Yeah, I think that's a major barrier. And even going back to what Rodina said earlier about, retaliation or fear of that. I think we have to also understand from the perspective of, a sexual trauma victim, it's not like you're tattling on somebody for stealing cookies out of the break room. This person, violated your personhood. And I think for other women or people in the workplace, a barrier to coming forward is this fear that, oh my gosh, I may be next. If he did that to one woman, what would stop him from doing it to me? Or is he going to go further? Is it going to actually become more violent? How will I be punished? I think that's probably, the biggest barrier aside from my job, not just, my ability to make a living, but is this going to impact my life? Will I be breathing if I come forward and say something?
And the distinction of the parallel between Russell and L.A. Reid and how L.A. Reid treated Drew, like I just couldn't help but to notice how it just felt as if he was retaliating on her on behalf of Russell. It just almost seems as if that's exactly what he was doing. And when you love what you do and you also honor the people that you work with, the relationships that you're building, like the last thing you want to do to balance your job, fight against it really is a man, like
Darlene, I think we
see.
can everybody hear Darlene? Or was that just on my end that she was breaking up?
She was breaking up
Can
on
you hear me?
mine.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now, but right in the middle of you saying it kind of went out.
What all did you catch?
It broke up most of what you were saying.
Most of it. Oh, I was and how as though sometimes, or I couldn't help but to think about how L.A. Reid's response to Drew in terms of him retaliating against her. I feel as though sometimes people, if they have a certain relationship with someone else, that they feel like they have to retaliate on behalf of their friend. So it just came across to me as though she had to pay some sort of lesson and as a result, her job was compromised. She wasn't able to effectively bring these artists to the table, and she was rejected at every single level when it came to her working with LA Reid. So we also have to be cognizant of when we are like our own personal motives in the workplace, and whenever people are retaliating on behalf of someone else. And that is something that I see that's common in a workplace as well.
Mhm. Lawanda in the comments said, I think continuing the conversation, providing a safe space and affirmation to people who experience sexual trauma to speak out no matter what, affirming that support is there for them. And I agree 100%. Creating that protective environment and affirming that, it's okay and people are there for you if you come out with something like this.
Mhm.
So this is such a good conversation, such a good discussion. I'm going to move on to our last question as we wrap things up. But Drew mentioned not wanting chaos as a result of speaking out. She was married at the time and she also had young kids. Do you think that this is a common reason that other women don't speak up about rape for fear of disrupting other parts of their lives?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Because even for her, it wasn't just about what she shared, right? Because they were going into her life and they were going into investigating her, which means that, and when you come out publicly, the people around you are also seeing a different part of you. And now they're seeing you in the lens of the trauma of what you're sharing. So oftentimes, it does affect your relationship because even along, we don't know what she shared with her husband, what she didn't, and what coming out may have, caused and what that affects in regards to sexuality. I mean, there's just so many things that happens when you are being sexually assaulted and coming out. I mean, one of the girls, she was in a relationship when that happens. So how does that affect her partner to hear about this during their relationship? So I think it definitely isn't often. I mean, we know that there's minimal crimes that are just about that person who's experiencing it. It
Right.
often affects the community, their family, and people around them.
And she had been in a previous relationship with Russell, the woman that you're speaking about. They were previously intimate, and this was a couple of years later that this sexual assault happened. So her coming out with it, and she had a boyfriend at the time. Who knows how that would have been received by him, and anyone else to just say, how many times are victims not believed? And so many people think, well, you were already intimate with this person, so now it's rape. So many dynamics, and that is just creating another level of chaos emotionally and just within their world. So I think that's a huge reason why so many people don't speak up because it's like, don't want to open that door again. One thing that stuck out to me was Drew said this was towards the end of the film, and she said it was as if she had hit pause on a movie for 20 years, and then she hit play right and was like right in the middle of all of a sudden she's right back in the middle of like the scariest part of the movie,
Mm.
and that was so powerful. And she ended up divorcing her husband after she came out with this, which was, man, I said, wow, she needed to process it, and she had just held on all that time on pause almost, and needed to process who she was after coming out because she wasn't the same person.
Yeah, when you talk to survivors after a
Yeah.
sexual assault, the first thing that they often say is, I don't want my partner to find out. I don't want my parents, my boss, my children. Like, it's not even about them. They're so worried about the disruption of the life of other people around them. And they always put others' well-being and feelings before their own. And then especially as a mother, you put your children's well-being. And she said, my husband doesn't like chaos, and she knew chaos was going to come. And so for 25 years she kept this inside to protect everyone else. Almost, it was as much as she was protecting herself in a way. Really, I think part of it was protecting other people, from experiencing that chaos and that disruption.
Yeah, and that's a sad and I think difficult place to be in when you're in a marriage. And Rodina is the counselor here, so I'm not going to step on that. But I think it's important for survivors